Hey guys, how's it going? Looks like I'm being set up there. All right, so thanks for. Huh? Oh, thanks for joining me during live stream. Sorry, YouTube was sending me a weird notification, so I took a second to read that, and it was completely irrelevant to the stream. Tevia, thanks for joining us right off the gate. Today we are talking about Flash number 100. Oh, sorry, Quick and the Dead. And this is a bit of a different review because, normally we are, like, for especially these live reviews, looking at more current stuff, but I have looked at older things from time to time and do have quite a bit of backlog. Not so far back that it goes all the way to 1995, but today I wanted to do kind of a retro review and look at one of these older comics I have kicking around. In part because, as I can see already in chat, like, there's a lot of fond feelings for this series. This is a time back when Wally West was the Flash and Barry Allen was effectively written out of the story, and he had been going for 100 issues now, all the way from, like, basically the Crisis of Infinite Earths. So this issue in particular, like, even though it came out in 95, it still costs $5 Canadian, or $3.50 American, and is a kind of a more blockbuster issue. It's got that holographic cover with the text, and it is a little longer than normal, I think. Let me see the page count here. Yeah, 38 pages. And but it's still on newsprint. It's still a comic kind of straight out of the 90s. It very much has that 90s kind of art. I pulled a couple of clips there so you can kind of see what I'm talking about, but even just looking at it here, very much the art style and pattern of superhero comics has reached a sort of level of quality where it's really kind of resembling what we might expect out of modern comics. The art's by a whole bunch of people, but Steve Larroca in particular does the pencils and stuff, and his work really stands out for me. But he didn't even do every single page, so that's a little complicated, and there's 5 people on the cover, and then even more when you get into the breakdown of who did what, which they do kind of go over on the initial splash pages and stuff. I did kind of write out some of that in the description of the video if you're curious, but otherwise we're mostly going to stick to talking about Larroca as the artist, but also just the stand-in for all the artists of this book. And they do a really good job. The 90s art can kind of be a lot of different things, but this series kind of feels like it fits in with the general DC aesthetic they've established over time. Like, if you look at, in particular, these splash pages with all these mainstay characters like Max Mercury and Impulse, along with Wally West when he does show up. But there's also like that certain dynamic, we'll say, like, dramatic style of artwork that really accentuates everything from facial expressions to action that was very typical of the 90s. By and large, that stuff works. It's an action-heavy book, but it feels big. Everything about this particular issue feels very large in scale. For those that haven't read it, and that's more than fair considering it's like 28 years old, I believe. But the book is a pretty interesting. So it starts out, and it is the end of a story arc, so I'm not sure I'm going to get into the whole build up to all of this, but basically Wally West has disappeared and nobody knows where he is, so it's up to his friends like Iris West, Linda Allen, I think. I don't know if she's called Linda Allen yet, but and the Pied Piper, along with other major figures like speedsters such as Impulse and Max Mercury, as I mentioned earlier, as well as Justice League figures such as Kyle Rayner, the Green Lantern of this time period, and beyond, but the only Green Lantern of this time period. Superman and Batman, along with Robin and Cyborg, appear, I believe. So it's a big issue in that regard. Kobra is aiming to take over the world, and it feels that way with all of these superheroes involved in the story. And with Wally West gone, it very much feels like this big struggle, and various characters, but especially Linda, who kind of really gets to shine in this story and has some really cool beats of action. And as Tevia points out, Tim Drake is Robin of this time period. So it's really fun to just see this little snapshot of DC in the 90s as well, and going back to this. And Superman with that, the long hair. Tevye Smoka says, when I think of Kobra, I think of G.I. Joe. I definitely thought of that a lot too, in no small part because his costume, like the Kobra DC character, and that costume very much resembles like a G.I. Joe character. I assume they're not supposed to be tied together because as far as I know, G.I. Joe comics were only ever like affiliated with Marvel, but I could be wrong. So eventually Wally West basically emerges from the Speed Force, which is a really interesting side of this comic and part of what I wanted to talk about because, and I was thinking about it when I was kind of going over this book and reading through it. I was like, oh yeah, the Speed Force didn't exist before this, and I found that very interesting. We think of it as this very integral part of Flash storytelling, and it was kind of name dropped before this, but Mark Waid very much brought it into, well, it wasn't name dropped, I think. Anyways, it was Flash number 700 where Max Mercury named it, whatever that corresponds to. But regardless, Mark Waid is the one who kind of came up with that idea and really grew the Flash into something that wasn't there before. It almost reminds me of what Jeff Johns would go on to do for Green Lantern in the following decade or something like that. So it's just cool to think about because the Speed Force is now just such a big part of the Flash and so core to his identity that it isn't that old. It almost would be as if Kryptonite came for Superman decades after his introduction, which is, not quite as true. Rion, thanks for joining us. So it's a really cool book and a really cool era of the Flash. It's well regarded for a reason, and when you consider the fact that it introduces stuff like the Speed Force, it obviously is very relevant to Flash history to this day. Tevye was saying Mark Waid, Wally West Flash run is friggin' fantastic, and that's kind of part of what I was reviewing here, is to sort of bring it up and be like, hey, there's all this Flash content in the present day, but I just happened to get this book in a random bag of comics someone gave me, and I was reading through it. I was like, oh yeah, the Flash books from this time period are really good. And when you compare it, and this is definitely part of what the review and what I wanted to talk about a little bit today, when you compare it especially to the Flash TV show or the current Flash comic books, this comic, but even just kind of going back to this era of Flash storytelling, really felt like a breath of fresh air to me. And I started thinking a little bit about why that is, because I don't love taking that position. I don't want to be that curmudgeonly comic book fan that says like, oh, Flash hasn't been good for decades or something like that. And I don't necessarily want to say that's entirely true. The Flash has definitely had his moments over the years since this Mark Waid run. But I was thinking about, and Tevye is saying, Smoke was saying, I think Jeremy Adams' current Flash book is also really good in my opinion. I haven't read that, for example, but I was thinking of the stuff with like Williamson or the Strength Force and all of those books, and I definitely was getting a lot of lackluster memories of those in comparison to this. And I was also, I've been kind of stuck and moving very slowly through the post-Crisis of Infinite Earths CW Flash episodes, and really feeling as though, in comparison, those books are and episodes of television are way behind, oddly enough, this 28-year-old book. They feel... Well, and Tevye was saying, oh yeah, the other forces, that was a missed opportunity. And because I guess both of these, like both the show and the comics, are what this book really reminded me of. Because we have like, oh, this really cool groundbreaking book where it broke ties with Barry Allen. It brought in Wally West. It kind of was controversial when you think about it like that. But it really found its own voice and stuff. And brought in all this now integral elements to the Flash storytelling. And by the way, the Speed Force isn't really even named yet. Wally just sort of emerges from this mysterious realm where he has this sense of kind of what happened to him, but it will be explored going forward more and more. And you compare that to these stories that introduce what should be as big a deal in theory, the strength force and the other forces like the still force. I can't even remember the other one, the sage force. Yeah. And maybe there's more that I'm not even aware of. And I feel as though these things should have, like I said, been as big a deal as an introduction of the speed force. Something like these other force domains should introduce us to like a whole other roster of characters and storytelling, and something on the level of like the rainbow core of Green Lantern. I don't know why, but I'm using the filler word like quite a bit in this stream, and I do apologize. It's something that I had been working on and had gotten pretty good at filtering out of my speech, but it's creeping in this stream, and I'm going to work on that. Tevi was saying, in fact, this story introduced the Speed Force way before Jeff Johns did, which I approved and personally think this was my favorite era because it gave Wally West and Linda Park a great romance. Yeah, and when I bring up Jeff Johns, I'm saying Jeff Johns sort of brought about this level of change to the Green Lantern franchise, as Mark Waid did to the Flash franchise, although I feel as though Mark Waid gets less credit for what he did for the Flash than Jeff Johns did for Green Lantern. So that's why I kind of brought up that comparison. Man, I need some water. Sorry guys, but I was losing my voice there. But we've been going for a good 12 minutes or so maybe we will leave it at that. I will say before we go, and it usually takes me forever to wrap up anyways, I agree with what Tevi was saying, that the Linda Park and Wally West romance was well done. I enjoy how Iris shows up and stuff, but it very much is, this is Linda's story in this issue, which I find really interesting and fun. It gets into also, we'll talk a little bit about the representation of that, because Linda Park is an interesting character, and the first thing I thought of when I thought of her, okay, well, so it's also bringing up the actress, which is unfortunate. Let me... What I wanted to check is a couple of things. Just bring in something up that I was not sure about. Okay, well... okay. So yeah, it's Linda Park West. I don't remember when they got married exactly. Oh, and this is the friggin' other continuity one. Like the New 52 era. So, what I was gonna say is, it is a nice example of like an interracial relationship. I kind of wanted to look up some of the details of that before I spoke on it too much, because I do like that. It does feel as though she's drawn in a way where that's kind of left ambiguous. Tevi is saying he thinks they got married in issue 200. I wasn't sure where we are on that timeline, and that's what I was kind of curious about too. But it is a good example of where that kind of thing can develop in a positive way. And Linda was a new character who was kind of given her own voice, which is kind of a common complaint I hear when it comes to like bringing in diverse characters into old franchises and stuff. So it was just something else I wanted to kind of touch on for a minute, that this book kind of also did that well, although it does almost that anime thing where everyone's kind of drawn the same, even though there is decent diversity when you break down the ethnicity of some of these characters. It's just not, and it's not that it has to be obvious, it's just sort of, you could easily forgive someone for reading this book and assuming Linda Park was white, and that shouldn't really be in the art. Like, that should kind of be apparent beyond stereotypical artwork too. So it's kind of my one criticism of the art, I suppose, but I'm also very forgiving of that. It's just when we're talking about it, if we're talking about representation and stuff. Oh, Tevye found it. They got married in issue 142. I did feel like we were kind of pretty far along in that relationship and stuff, but I don't know what happens in issue 200 now either. It's not exactly as if I've read these books in recent times, and I'd have to go over it pretty much all again to really have a concrete sense of it. Still, it wouldn't be too hard to find either collected editions of this run or online runs as well that are worth doing. And just to follow up on what I was saying about the representation thing, Linda's a good example of that, even if it isn't like drawn the best here or whatever, because it is kind of the thing that the books can easily, or future writing and adaptations of this content can easily follow up on, and kind of should. And you compare that to ones where I guess we'll say we force the diversity in, or the common complaint is just where we're changing the racial identity of the characters without really putting any further thought into it, other than just sort of following a quota. You compare that to, yes, there might be a little bit to be desired in terms of how Linda Park is drawn, but there isn't much in terms of how she is written. She's I had to double check just to make sure, but yeah, she's the child of Korean immigrants, and they raised her in Chicago, so it's all sort of part of her character, leading to a little bit of toughness, which really shows off in this issue where she's shooting guns and fighting off Kobra's army and stuff like that. And that makes for a very solid character, kind of what reminds me of what the Flash show kind of did with Iris West and stuff like that in the show. In its better moments, we'll say, in spite of like its issues around that, it does feel as though for a while at least she was the leader of Team Flash and kind of found her place in that storytelling. But I feel as though I'm getting particularly rambly as this review goes on. Tevye is saying, heck, both Linda and Wally had kids named Iris West II and Jay West, which is really awesome and tons of fun. As a bonus, she's a great mother, which I approve. Oh, and that's a really good point too, is I was kind of focusing on where her character was up until this point, but it is worth reflecting on where her character goes. And when Tevye is saying like she's a great mom, he's not being like dismissive of everything up to that point. She kind of grows into that role, and it's really well done. And yeah, Iris West II and Jay West are both really fun, and also further compound that diversity. It's pretty cool that Wally West, by canon, and like just as Wally West has been established, is really just sort of destined to be paired up with Linda Park and inevitably be in this interracial relationship that has these kids. I think that's a really positive thing that's just long existed in the Flash continuity, even alongside stuff like the New 52 Wally West also existing, and the Flash Wally West being quite a bit of a different character. That really doesn't discount the possibility of there being a Linda Park future, even though, you know, that CW ship appears to be sinking, and who knows what's going on with the Flash or whatever, based on all that Ezra Miller stuff these days. So Tevye saying, indeed, and seeing Linda fighting Kobra alongside other heroes was really awesome. She really shines in this issue. I've said that a few times now, but she's the star of this book. She's on the first page. It's about her dealing with the possible death of Wally while also struggling with this crisis and not really being useless. In some ways, she does kind of rescue Wally West, and I was going to say it almost reverses that damsel in distress trope, even if the mechanism of her releasing Wally is kind of mysterious at this point and just sort of around like the Flash ring, but she does kind of use it, and she is the one who sort of brings him back, which is really cool. It is her story in a lot of ways, and Wally really only shows up at the end. But what a great character. And one thing I will say that I think people are kind of right to complain about is it feels as though she, the kids, and to a degree this version of Wally West has sort of been lost in the shuffle of a lot of contemporary DC comic books, between what happened with Heroes in Crisis and whatever they're doing these days. It doesn't really seem like there's a big presence of any of these characters these days, and that's disappointing. The last time I saw them, and I am behind on a lot of things with DC Comics and intend to keep up, but last time I saw any of them was in like the stuff with death metal, and that was like years ago now, so who knows. Tevia says, I blame Dan Didio and his hatred of Wally West. I know that's a common trope in fandom, that Didio never really liked Wally West, but for one thing, it's not like Dan's around to really have a lot of sway at DC these days. And for another, like, I don't really understand if that's particularly what he was ever going for, or if he just wanted to go for more traditional characters and established DC presences or something like that. But I will say I don't particularly think it's all on him. Tom King wrote Heroes in Crisis, and Didio was kind of on his way out already then, and at this point it definitely could change. Maybe things will change with all this Dark Crisis stuff that's going on, but for now it just seems as though DC's kind of dropped the ball for now. Or perhaps it's just one of those situations where Wally West is always just sort of waiting in the wings to just be Barry Allen's successor, which, while that sounds like it does kind of suck, when you have situations like Ezra Miller, basically there's no way he can keep playing the Flash going forward, suddenly that stuff seems a lot more relevant and up for play in major motion pictures and stuff. So it's not as though all hope is lost for Linda Park or Wally West or any of that stuff. Tevye does recommend I check out the Jeremy Adams Flash book, and that's a great idea because that will catch me up to speed. Pun, I'm sure, intended by Tevye. And he was saying it's also a great story and retcons Heroes in Crisis out of existence. Oh, I didn't know that, so I'll definitely have to check that out. Tevye also says, as a bonus, Jeremy Adams gives Wally West back as the Flash, which I approve. Oh, I didn't even know that. So clearly I'm out of date, and those last few closing statements will have to be amended a little bit. But really, that's just all the more reason for you guys to subscribe to the channel, because I'll just have to check out those books and give an update, because I am clearly behind on some things. I've only been able to keep up on a small handful of books, and everything else I just have massive amounts of reading to do and just catching up in general. So, like, because along with those readings, it's usually good for me to stream and talk about my feelings and stuff about that. So, until then, we'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island. Oh, and thanks, Tevye, for participating in the stream, and Rian for joining, and everyone else who came along the way, of course.